Right. Hello and welcome. Today we are going to share information about maintaining well-being while engaging with challenging material. We decided to focus on this topic because art is an important part of our lives, whether it's books, movies, TV shows, music, other live performance, whatever. It's a really vital part of our human experience. But for a lot of people who have experienced trauma, and that is a lot of us, the question often comes up, how can I engage with art and be thoughtful about how to handle material that might activate a trauma response? And we'll talk more about what that activation means in a few minutes. But first, I wanted to introduce you all to our presenters in the order that we'll be sharing today. So I'm Amanda. I'm the Sexual Assault Program Director at Family Support Center, which is an agency providing free and confidential services to folks who have experienced violence here in the Chippewa Valley, in Eau Claire and Chippewa counties in West Central Wisconsin. And I'm joined by my colleague from Family Support Center, Morgan, who is also an advocate, and Asia, who is a UW Eau Claire capstone student in the WGSS program. So here's what we're hoping to cover today. We'd like to start out by discussing the neurobiology of trauma and why past trauma can be reactivated. Then we'll move into an overview of how traumatic experiences can collide with the emotions that we experience when we are engaging with art. And finally, we're going to be spending a lot of our time together going over some strategies for taking care of both ourselves and others so that we can reconcile our desire to have art in our lives with our healing needs. And with that said, we invite you to use this presentation in whatever way makes sense to you. Since it's pre-recorded, you can feel free to stop and start it as needed. We aren't going to include any graphic descriptions of traumatic events, but we do understand that even thinking about trauma in an abstract sense can be overwhelming sometimes, and there's absolutely no shame in going at your own pace. Okay, so this might be a review for some folks, but we want to make sure we're all starting with similar information. So understanding why trauma responses happen and why past trauma can be reactivated. I'm going to begin with this quote from Judith Herman. Traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. And so when our usual tools and resources that we use to cope with everyday life events are inadequate in addressing trauma, then our brain has a contingency plan. So I like to encourage folks to think about trauma versus a trauma. We often equate a trauma with an event, which is finite. But trauma in a general sense, that extends beyond that initial impact. If we begin by looking at the event itself, though, the amygdala is the part of the brain that deals with emotional processes. And so when a threat is detected, it basically opens up a floodgate that prompts our body to respond immediately, and it's important to remember this, automatically. And so Morgan is going to talk a little bit more about that.
All right, thank you, Amanda. Okay, so we're going to now kind of launch into talking about how these trauma responses can look. Kind of the three big ones, then we're also going to touch on a fourth one that we're kind of starting to see in this work. So, the first one we can think of is fight. And what those kind of reactions we see with the body, that would be a change in body temperature, either feeling hotter or colder kind of suddenly. Your heart rate is going to increase. You might be able to kind of hear your heart in your ears, kind of like that blood pumping. You can get tunnel vision. So, you're kind of just laser focused on the threat that's in front of you. And, for the purposes of this demonstration and presentation, we're going to kind of say you're hiking and you see a bear, as that graphic there kind of indicates. And your pupils might dilate because you're trying to see, more of what's going on too. That second trauma response that we see, the most common one is flight as well. So you'll see those same kind of physiological reactions, change in body temperature, increased heart rate, tunnel vision, pupils, but then, instead of your body telling you, okay, we're going to fight, we got to fight this threat, your body and brain are telling you, hey, we got to get out of here. We're going to run away from this threat. And then another trauma response we see is freeze. And this is actually quite a bit more common than people might think. I know you hear the phrase flight or fight, but we always kind of want to think flight, fight, freeze. And with that freeze, you become immobile. You may feel a sense of disconnection or disassociation. You might even feel like you're having a kind of out of body experience. And our brains are really good in the moment of detecting a threat and kind of giving our body some cues of what to do. But there comes a point where that kind of hey, there's a threat response can start to become kind of detrimental as opposed to helpful. And that's something we often see. We don't always want to, every time we go outside, think, oh my God, there's going to be a bear. But there might be, signs and hints in certain contexts where that might become more apparent. You might see a paw print, or maybe some berries, or kind of smell the same trees, or something like that. And then, yes, like I just said there, our brain is really good at protecting us, but it can be kind of bad at realizing, okay, the threat has passed now. I can kind of, calm down these bodily responses. And, kind of like I was just saying, it's like, let's say on a hike once you saw a bear or heard a bear. For example, this actually did happen to me once I was out for a hike. I heard a bear growl, and immediately I could hear my blood pumping in my ears. I had to run. My body just kind of responded. But, every time I'm outside, it would be kind of detrimental if my body had that response. And then, I spoke earlier about, that fourth response that we see. So we've got, fight, flight, freeze. But then we also have fawn, which is kind of a newer response that we're kind of exploring in this field, and that one is more so, kind of avoiding conflict by just being kind of a yes man, if you're familiar with that expression, not being able to say no, prioritizing other people's needs over your own, because, this trauma response, it's a learned behavior like other trauma responses, but you've learned that if you just kind of go along with things, then you won't have to deal with those same traumatic outcomes, or maybe it won't be as bad.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. I think it's important to point out too that activation or reactivation of those initial trauma responses aren't only limited to isolated incidents of trauma, such as encountering a bear, but they can also encompass these long-term events as well, or complex trauma. So an example of that would be experiencing or witnessing abuse in childhood, experiencing intimate partner violence, oppression linked to racism, heterosexism, transphobia, ableism, and other forms, incarceration and poverty or precarity and insecurity, and attaining those basic needs in life can also be forms of complex trauma. And, like Morgan mentioned, that not only fight, flight, and freeze, but fawning is another adaptation to try to cope with that, those lasting impacts of trauma. So now we're going to take a look at how our traumatic experiences and our engagement with art bump up against each other, sometimes in undesirable ways. Basically, why this happens is because art is all about stimulating emotion. These emotions aren't always pleasant, But feeling an unpleasant emotion in response to art is not the same as a trauma response, or trauma activation, I should say. Still, I want to make sure to emphasize that, if you don't like it when art brings up an unpleasant emotion, it's okay to acknowledge that. For trauma survivors, especially those who are coping with, for example, hypervigilance, having those emotions elicited by art can feel manipulative or deceitful or unsafe. And that might extend into trauma activation in some cases. In fact, not infrequently does this happen. And that trauma activation can happen when art contains themes or ideas or imagery that are directly related to a person's trauma. So, for example, if someone survived an earthquake and they're watching a movie about a person who survives an earthquake, that might lead to trauma activation. But it can also happen when the sensory input of art includes really specific elements that are related to a person's trauma. And they're ones that aren't objectively upsetting. So, for example, if someone was in an accident and that accident happened on Main Street, and then they're listening to music and there's a reference to Main Street in a song, that also might prompt trauma activation. And when it comes to that latter type of trauma activation, that is understandably more difficult to predict. Certainly for most of us who wouldn't consider like a reference to the phrase Main Street to be alarming in any way, but it can also be really unpredictable and scary to think about for the person going through that trauma activation as well. When it comes to that former type of potentially activating content, so like the known content, trauma survivors are often of two minds. And I'm just going to speculate that the assumption is that most survivors would want to avoid art that reminds them of their trauma. And for some people, that is, in fact, the case. This could be because they've been activated by similar material in the past, or it might simply be because they are so worried that about the trauma activation happening that they want to avoid even the possibility of encountering it. Either way, we should never tell someone that they must expose themselves to potentially activating art in order to get over it. There's another side of the coin, though, and that's survivors who want to seek out art related to their trauma. This could be because they want to have their experiences validated. It could be another part of their individual healing processes. There is a myth, though, that number one, that this means that their trauma won't possibly be activated. There's still the risk that they will experience activation when they are engaging with art, even if they're engaging with it on purpose. And again, we should not tell someone that, if you really experience trauma, you would avoid this art. That is not appropriate either, because both of these are really reasonable approaches to coping with and navigating the impact of trauma. All right, I'm going to hand it back to Morgan to talk about maintaining well-being while engaging with challenging material.
And things we can do when we are engaging with this material. So it's really important to honor your full range of emotions. And something I read somewhere once said, every feeling you're having is okay. Yes, even those feelings. So I think it's really important to just no matter what you're feeling, don't judge it, acknowledge it, of course, but you don't need to place a moral value on your emotions. And as the whole thing popped up said, and do some background work too. I mean, personally, I don't believe in spoilers, which serves me pretty well in consuming media because that way I'm not upset when I get a spoiler, but also I'm one of those people who will go on the Wikipedia synopsis and read what happens in the series. If I think it might be activating or upsetting, or if I'm just not in the mood to see, a 30-minute long war scene today, for example, it's okay to look into things and kind of know what you're getting into before you're getting into it. And the importance of knowing when not to engage with media, choose a time that's right. Maybe you would want to make sure that you get to watch this alone in order to take better care of yourself. Or, on the flip side of that coin, maybe you want to make sure that your partner or your best friend or your sister or someone else is there to watch it with you who is a good support. And, considering who is in your support system, kind of keeping those people in mind, partner, sister, best friend, cousin, etc. And be kind to yourself, be gentle. I mean, this is tough stuff. It's not easy to experience trauma responses, especially when it's, the latest, hottest Netflix show that everybody's ranting and raving about. You don't have to like something just because, it's popular and it's now. You don't have to engage with it. So if you're not ready, don't force yourself to be. And, unfortunately, sometimes even when we do all of those things diligently, we do prepare ourselves, we do our best, sometimes we still find ourselves activated. So what do we do? One thing that can be really helpful is calming breaths. So there is a technique, it's called box breathing. I'm just going to briefly kind of talk about it. It's breathe out slowly, release all the air from your lungs, breathe in through your nose as you slowly count to 4, hold your breath for a count of 4, exhale for another count of 4, hold your breath again for a count of 4, and we call it the box because it's 4 seconds, kind of those 4 activities. So hold, or like breathe in, hold, release, and repeat. And then we have the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which is kind of the bread and butter for people in my field. It's really helpful and it's something I use a lot. So 5, acknowledging 5 things you can see around you. 4 things you can touch around you. That could be your feet on the floor. It could be, your water bottle. It could be a pen. 3 things you can hear. So that could be, music or a sound machine. I'm just kind of listing off things that I can hear right now. So anything you can hear. 2 things you can smell. And, that one can be kind of tough if we're in public. So maybe if you can't smell 2 things, or you don't really want to consciously smell your breath in that moment, you could think of 2 things you wanted to smell, lavender or like fresh brewed coffee, something like that. And then 1 thing you can taste for the 1. So that could be, gum in your mouth. And again, if you're in public, the taste one can be tricky sometimes. So maybe 1 thing you want to taste, or the alternate thing I like to do for 1 is just list off 1 thing you like about yourself. That can kind of help your brain focus on another thought and task. So that's the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it can be tweaked too for your needs. And then next up is just kind of what to do when you start having these feelings. You kind of realize, okay, this is going on. So, sensing that something is coming up, something's going on. Naming it, being like, okay, I'm feeling anxious. Attribute, you could be like, okay, what's making me feel this way? Is it maybe this episode? I know this one's been tough for me to watch in the past. And then evaluating. So like, okay, what can I do with this emotion or feeling? Could I shut off the TV? Could I call my best friend? And then acting, shutting off the TV, calling your best friend, pausing it, taking a second to just breathe a bit. And kind of again with my whole spoilers thing and lack thereof, or my belief in them, you can scan for content. Let's say you're reading a book and you're like, this kind of feels like it's building up to someone. Just flip some pages. Look for those kind of like buzzwords or kind of words that kind of jump out at you, and then decide if you want to proceed. Maybe at that point, get on Wikipedia, look at the synopsis, see where things are going to go. And then just knowing and really honoring when it's time to reach out for help. You've utilized all your tools. You've done your breathing. You've done your 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You've checked for spoilers, but you're still not feeling centered and 100% comfortable. Reach out, the support systems, and then also your external support systems. Advocates here at Family Support Center, we have a 24/7 crisis line. Someone will always be there to answer your call. If you're a student at UWEC, CASA is our satellite office there too, and they are a great support as well. And then we've got some other support lines listed here, some specific for trans folks, Indigenous folks, deaf folks. It's a video phone line, so they're able to translate ASL. And then we also have an LGBTQ intimate partner violence line as well. And then I will hand it over to Asia.
Perfect. Okay. So while Morgan handled most of the information regarding self-care when handling potentially activating content, I was hoping to provide examples of possible community care resources that educators and facilitators can use when addressing this activating content. The number one most helpful material might possibly be a content warning. So a content warning is a spoken or written statement that alerts your audience of the nature of your materials, whether you're viewing materials like watching a movie, reading materials that could be anywhere from, books, memoirs, theory, or anything you're discussing within your time together. These notices will flag the content of the material that follows, so your readers and listeners can begin to prepare themselves to adequately engage, or if necessary, adequately disengage for the sake of their own well-being. And by providing these content warnings, you're communicating to your audience that you not only acknowledge their individual experiences and their well-being, but you also are very insistent in modeling a community of care. So an example of these content warnings, they're providing one in this comic, but an example of content warning I'll provide today. For written content warning, you can start at the beginning of the page. You can start your description with the warning type. So that can either say something like content warning, trigger warning, and then you can add keywords. The goal for keywords is to make them clear enough that people know the content they're expecting, but not so descriptive that they might trigger the reaction that we're hoping to avoid by providing these content warnings. So a good example of that would be writing something like content warning and then providing a colon. And some examples could be racism, violence, discussion of socioeconomic class, and racist slurs. For a verbal content warning, very similar, but it does look a little bit different. Make a verbal note of the sensitive content and also remind your audience that their well-being is valuable and is just as valuable as the information that you're providing. And it's crucial for a productive and engaging learning environment. So an example of that would look something like, you could say something similar to, today's lecture contains materials addressing themes of racism, violence, and discussion of socioeconomic class. I acknowledge this content may be difficult, and I encourage you to care for your safety and well-being, engaging or disengaging as necessary. So moving on to the next slide, focusing on the comic. So this comic was written and illustrated by author M. Slade, who is a contributing comic artist for Everyday Feminism. He's a New York-based cartoonist and illustrator. We really like this example. If you're looking for further resources about content warnings, this comic is titled Content Warnings, What They Are and What They Aren't. So it provides a closer look into utilizing content warnings in the classroom and how simple they really can be. Lastly, another facet of facilitating conversation and caring for your community is accepting feedback from your community when providing content. So encouraging your students to come forward about content they feel warrants a content warning, whether or not you had thought about it and provided the content warning before it had happened. Because I mean, like we had discussed earlier in the presentation, your triggers and your sensitive content may not relate at all to the people who you are sharing this content with. So you're never going to have, like this overarching umbrella of like every content warning, every statement of safety that you're going to need. So it's totally okay if someone comes up and says something along the lines of, if at any point in the semester I felt uncomfortable because of this specific topic that was covered in class, it is totally acceptable and encouraged to encourage your students or just your audience in general to provide that comfort of maintaining that conversation. So you could say something along the lines of, for example, if at any point in the semester you feel uncomfortable because of topics covered in this class, please set up a private appointment with me to meet individually or shoot me an email. And then also acknowledge that it is important for all members of our community to contribute to safe and accessible learning atmospheres.
Yeah, thanks, Asia. I also wanted to mention with that last one, the point that you made about, keeping an open door, figuratively and literally sometimes, but not demanding that extensive disclosure. So just trusting the community, the learning community that you're part of, and ensuring that students do not have to go to great lengths to disclose lots of details about the personal impact of potentially activating content in order to have you acknowledge that their feelings and their responses are real and valid. So I also want to talk about making connections with advocates and other resources as kind of a way to put a little bow on this section. We understand that it can be a struggle to incorporate some of these trauma-informed and trauma-driven structures for engaging with art. It's not something that we have all had a lot of practice in implementing. So if you are struggling to find appropriate resources for someone you care about, or in a classroom setting for your students, we've talked too about if you are organizing or promoting a community arts event, like a book group or a music festival, and just need to know how to make that space more accessible for students or people in general who have experienced trauma. Please reach out to advocates and other resources in the community. Make those connections. You can definitely give us a call at Family Support Center. And if we don't have the answers ourselves, we'll work with you on figuring it out, because we all do better when we're working together, right? So on behalf of Morgan and Asia, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us. I think that when these topics are demystified, there's more compassionate understanding of what trauma survivors are going through. And there's less stigma in equipping people with those tools that they need to be fully present with everything our world has to offer, including the enrichment and beauty of art. So thank you, and we hope you utilize this information in the future.